Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Williams, and I'm here with my fellow MacArthur Memorial historian, Jim Zobel, and today we're going to be talking about the Korean War, specifically the first couple weeks of the war and what General Douglas MacArthur was thinking during this time and what he was doing. The Korean War began on June 25th, 1950, when North Korean forces invaded South Korea. The conflict escalated rapidly, prompting a United Nations response that was largely led by the United States. And when the war actually started on June 25th, MacArthur was then Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, and he was overseeing the post-World War II occupation and reconstruction of Japan. So what we're going to talk about today is what were his first thoughts about the conflict, his assessment, what did he know and when, and what did he do in those first 2 weeks before being named Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations command that would be set up. So that's what we're going to talk about. So Jim, the Korean War is a surprise to many people when it breaks out. In 1950, there had been a lot of friction between the North and the South, but nothing that had turned into an actual war or an invasion. So was MacArthur surprised in June 1950 when the war started? And how did he find out that it had started?
Yeah, I think he was. And I think he's at the embassy. Again, I think he gets a phone call, in the kind of like early in the morning, and gets a call from headquarters about what's going on. Muccio, Ambassador John J. Muccio, is the ambassador in Korea, and he's the one who's sending updates to Washington early. I think Washington gets the first message at like 9:00 on June 24th, because it's a day early. And Muccio waited for about 4 hours after North Koreans had gone into that Ongjin Peninsula and then moved across the border because he wanted to get like a full picture of it. And so then he sends that to Washington. I don't think MacArthur contacts Washington until about 12 hours after. He was trying to get a full picture as well. And I think at first, it did surprise. He had said many things prior to that, like in January of 49, he said he didn't think that the South Koreans would be able to fend off an attack. In September of 49, he had changed that around when he was talking to the congressman at that point. They had kind of written Korea as to be outside the littoral defense, both MacArthur in March of 50, as well as Atchison and the Secretary of State in January of 50. They had kind of made statements, and South Korea wasn't included in that. But
wasn't included in what they were doing in Japan?
Like what they see as their defense. Like MacArthur talks about the island chain of the Aleutians to Japan, to Okinawa, and later in 49 and early 50, he started, incorporating Formosa into that. But he doesn't ever talk about South Korea. And as well, that's what the State Department is saying as well. And I think when MacArthur had gone there for the independence in 48, he had made statements, he would defend South Korea like it was California. And that threw off Washington because they were like, we have no, treaty of defense for them. But when it happens, this is right during the time when the Soviets are making all those moves into Greece and Turkey. And, Truman's, I think, had enough at that point. And when they realize, I think when MacArthur's first message, he says, we think it's like 2 or 3 divisions, but it was like 7,000. It was 7 divisions, and it was like a 6,000 man tank brigade. And MacArthur on the 25th, he immediately, because he's getting word from Muccio about KMAG, and KMAG is this 500-man advisory group, and it can't defend itself. And so MacArthur authorizes sending munitions over there and using air power and naval power to guard this vessel that's going over there to bring these munitions. And he does that kind of without any clearance, from Washington. And so in the first hours, I think, he's surprised, but even by the 26th, he's thinking the South Koreans can handle it. But then they get wiped hard by that tank unit that the North Koreans have of all those Soviet tanks, and that's when they realize that that they're probably not going to be able to hold on, because I think like a whole division like evaporates when the North Koreans come through that Uijeongbu corridor.
Now, you said earlier, I mean, very early, like first day or so of the conflict, you said he's authorizing this transport of munitions to support KMAG and to support the South Korean military. Is there any criticism of that? This is essentially what, 12 or 13 days before he's actually named that UN commander for this conflict. So
Yeah,
does he
yeah.
have any, you said he has no authorization to do any of that. He's just taking action as he sees this need develop.
Well, in that sense, yeah, it's within 2 days they're authorized. Like by the 27th, they're going to throw the Seventh Fleet in the Taiwan Straits. They've authorized using naval as well as air power south of the 38th parallel. You're not allowed to go across the 38th parallel. And they saw that was as necessary because on the 26th, Muchio, who again is the ambassador in South Korea, he's ordering the evacuation of all civilians. So, I mean, there's freighters leaving, there's airplanes leaving. And basically, the munitions that are sent over there are just so that the KMAGs and the South Koreans can get out of the way, and be able to defend themselves. So, will it get there in time? Who knows? It's going to, take a while. But, MacArthur's doing something just so that they all don't get eradicated immediately. And so then, he's gonna do that again. On that 29th, when he flies over there, he authorizes a strike on a North Korean airfield, and so, I mean, that's done without authorization. Of course, people always rage on MacArthur for World War II and, not sending the bombers and destroying Formosan airfields, which he wouldn't be able to do. But then they criticize this. Oh, you did that, out of not having orders to do that. Well, you can't, criticize him for the same thing on two different occasions. So, it's just kind of ridiculous.
Do we know in these first couple of days of the war what his assessment of the conflict was in terms of, his view of the strength of the South Korean forces, of the North Korean, do we know what his assessment
Yeah,
was?
I mean, the South Korean army had about 98,000 members. But on the 27th, MacArthur sends his advanced survey team. This is under Brigadier General John Church. And Church flies into Suwon, which is the airport about 30 miles south of Seoul. And immediately they realize, at least, because they set it up with the chief of staff of the ROK Army. And out of 98,000 people in the army, only 24,000 have showed up. Everybody else has disappeared. And they're getting, pushed down pretty hard. And by the time Church gets there, he's supposed to be organizing, how they can, help the South Koreans logistically. But, because he's the only one that, really knows what's going on, he's immediately thrown in to organizing defenses on the Han River, right south of Seoul. So by the time of Church on the 28th, tells MacArthur that, these people I don't think are going to be able to hold, meaning the South Koreans. The North Koreans are, running right through them. And MacArthur takes it upon himself, I got to go see what's going on. And so on the 29th, he flies into Suwon himself to go see what's going on up at Seoul.
Does that meeting change his assessment? Does he, I know he does say some things about the leadership and stuff like that,
Yeah.
but what does he recommend then at that point?
Well, when he flies up, he meets with Syngman Rhee, who's the president, and he meets with Muchio. They're there at a schoolhouse at Suwon, and MacArthur's and Church is there, the brigadier general. And MacArthur's brought, all his staff. He's got, Edward Almond, who's his chief of staff. He's got Stratemeyer, who's his Air Force guy. He's got Pinky Wright, who's his operations guy. He's got Willoughby, his intelligence chief. And they all drive to the Han River, which is about 30 miles away. And there they set up right to watch the events for about an hour, and mortar fires going off all over the place. The South Korean army is going by them. And MacArthur says they've all got weapons and they're all, smiling and saluting. It's just that the leadership had evaporated. They had nothing. And so when he flies back that night, he immediately starts drafting up this message for the JCS, where he recommends throwing in American combat troops, because he says there's no way this is going to turn out good without a complete, Dunkirk unless we throw American troops in. But he doesn't send it that night. And the next morning, the JCS sends him a message saying, we've got the Formosa Straits that we're holding. You can use air power north of the 38th parallel. You can use sea power north of the 38th parallel.
So air and sea north of the 38th, nothing
Yeah.
else at this point. But
Yeah.
there's this
But
early authorization days into the war. Does that
yeah.
hold up for the rest?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the thing is, this message comes in before MacArthur had the chance to send that message he was drafting the night before. And so then he finishes drafting his message and sends it to the JCS where he's saying, I need to use troops, and totally ignores the message that they just sent him, a little while before that, but says, I need to send in a regimental combat team right now. And then they immediately get on one of these telecons, which is you're in front of a screen and the message comes through and it goes up on the screen. And so you've got a group of the people at the Pentagon and you've got MacArthur with his group in Tokyo, and they're talking through this telecon system. And that's where MacArthur says, I've got to send in this RCT now. Time is of the essence. And J. Lawton Collins is saying, you can send it over to Pusan, but you have to have presidential approval to be able to use American troops there. And during that meeting, Collins gets approval from Truman. Truman says, yes, we're going to do that. And I think the same day, Truman mentions to the press that MacArthur will probably be the UN commander. I mean, they haven't picked anybody, and it's not until the 8th of July that they recommend that. But by 1st of July, MacArthur's got the ability to use air, naval, and U.S. land forces in Korea, and they've voted the resolutions in the UN for all the nations to supply South Korea with whatever they can, because the Soviets weren't in the UN at that time. They were boycotting it, and so they weren't able to stall that in the Security Council. So it seems like he thought they could handle it, but within a day he knows they pretty much can't. And by the fourth, fifth day, he's saying, I need to use troops. And it's after he goes there and he pretty much comes up with the idea, I'm going to have to throw in troops to delay the North Koreans. And then I'm going to have to throw in troops to hold that Pusan area, to throw supplies in. Pusan's right at the south of South Korea. And he also comes up with the idea of some kind of amphibious move, to go in, because he immediately instructs his Joint Staff Planning Operations Group to start working on this Operation Blue Hearts for an invasion of Incheon with the 1st Cavalry Division.
So really within the first week, he's already thinking about Incheon.
Yeah, I mean, because I think he gets there and he's immediately like, okay, what did I do in World War II? And it's a miracle that they pull it all together, because they had downsized the Navy, they'd gotten rid of all the landing craft, everything else. So it's a hodgepodge sending them in there, and a lot of people criticize them for throwing in Task Force Smith and everything, but they did make the North Koreans stop and deploy, stop and deploy, stop and deploy, and that gave Walker time to get in there. And a lot of the criticism is just, general 2020 hindsight.
Now, you mentioned earlier Truman saying publicly, MacArthur will probably be the commander of what's going on there. Can you clarify that timeline at all? I mean, at what point when are those discussions being had? Do we know what MacArthur know? What's the timeline?
It's him thinking, but I think even in those first days, people within the government were saying, we don't even know if MacArthur will be in charge over there. But by the 30th, when Truman makes that, I think it's like an offhand comment, he's the commander in chief over there. He might be, the UN commander of it, and probably will be, but it's not till that when the UN starts looking for a commander, when they make we need to appoint a commander, the JCS unanimously picks MacArthur, to have this. And that's when they announce it is on 8 July, as he's going to be the UN commander.
Now, I know we talked about this earlier, but do you think at the very start of the war, he thought it would be him?
I don't know. I don't, I mean, he's the man on the scene,
Mm-hmm.
and, you would think that he probably does think, yeah, I'm here. I'm going to be running this show. The big thing was army commander would be Walton Walker. MacArthur would be the theater commander. And back in Washington, even in those early days, they're already talking about, should we send Ridgway over there to replace Walker? So, I mean, there's that kind of talk going on as well. Do we have the right people over there? Should we change drivers right at the beginning?
I always think it's such an incredible amount of responsibility that he has. I mean, I know the occupation of Japan is underway, perhaps winding down in some senses, but to do that and then to also have the responsibility for Korea, just an incredible workload.
Well, everybody had been watching Formosa, Taiwan. I mean, they'd had JCS wondering about that since about December of 49. The JCS had just come there. They only left on the 23rd, with Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, right? Bradley was there with them, and MacArthur had given him his memo about Formosa, and what they should do about that. And he called it that unsinkable aircraft carrier. And so I don't even think they were thinking about Korea. I mean, nothing in that memo that MacArthur writes even mentions Korea. It's all about Formosa. And so that's what they're thinking about. And then this explodes, over there on the peninsula. Now, Willoughby had made some pronouncements in March that June might be the time that they invade South Korea, but then he drew that right back. I mean, he had pretty good intelligence sources over there with Nichols, the Air Force guy that was doing signal intelligence, and you had the British down with a group in Hong Kong doing signal intelligence, and then you had this Korean liaison organization, and they knew that the Koreans had all these tanks up there, but they didn't pinpoint it.
Now, earlier you mentioned that, MacArthur has this meeting before the war even starts. You said it was with the JCS.
Yeah.
And what State Department people or?
Yeah, Dulles, John Foster Dulles is there because he's there talking about the peace treaty. I mean, Dulles was there on the Korean War front on the 38th parallel, like the day before.
Yeah. So,
and the 27th, when he left Japan, Dulles' aide said he had never seen MacArthur look more dejected and despondent.
Yeah.
Because he knew it was falling apart, in Korea at that point.
Or do you think that with the occupation maybe beginning to be in its final phase or so, do you think he had also been told that, when this is over and you come home, this is it? I mean, do you think they let him know, like, you are?
I don't know.
Retirement's here in a sense.
I don't know. I mean, because he was going to stay till the treaty came. And that's not until September of 51.
Right.
And they had been drawing down the forces, and that's another thing. All those troops, they're occupation troops. They talk about MacArthur not knowing what a bad state they were in and, not training everybody. But the best they were doing at that point was like battalion level training. But MacArthur wrote a message to the JCS in like late 48 saying, I'm down to 2 battalions instead of 3 battalions per regiment. You're sending me the dregs of society, as you're not sending all the good officers are going to Europe, and I mean, he's telling them exactly what's going on there. So, I mean, like I said, you can't have it both ways.
All right. So what have we missed anything leading up to July 8th when he kind of?
Yeah, probably a million things, but I mean, we could sit here for hours and hours.
Yeah. Yeah, but I guess the bottom line is he takes action very quickly as soon as the war starts. And then he does begin to advise the JCS what he thinks is happening on the ground, gives them his assessment. And then Truman pretty early decides it's probably going to be MacArthur.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other final thoughts about these first couple weeks of the war and MacArthur?
No, he wasn't responsible for Korea before it. The State Department was running it since 49. They were, MacArthur didn't have control because he knew the KMAG couldn't support themselves, that they had no way to defend themselves if this was going to happen. And I think that's why a lot of people basically wrote South Korea off, because they weren't giving any kind of major military buildup to because they were worried he was going to invade North Korea, the same way the North Koreans came in. But, that's it, just unseen circumstance. And then we get drawn into it for 3 years. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim, so much for joining us as always.
Thank you. Bye, Amanda.
Bye. Stay tuned. When we originally released this program, we used our social media platforms to ask our listeners for questions about this topic. What follows is that Q&A. So about a week ago, Jim, we sat down and we talked about MacArthur's reaction to the start of the Korean War. And we walked through kind of the first 2 weeks or so of that. And then we invited some questions from the audience, and we're going to go through those today and do that Q&A portion. Are you ready?
I am.
Okay. First question. Who made the decision to abandon South Korea in 1948, 1949? Little loaded question.
Well, they were going to hold this election, like the UN temporary commission was coming in, and they had worked it out so that the Soviet military would withdraw at the same time as the 24th Corps would withdraw. And so Hodge, who's Lieutenant General John Hodge, who has the 24th Corps there, they all prepare that and get it ready to get it out. And then I think John Coulter comes in right at the end of this period, and Hodge is gone. And the last few months, they pull out the 24th Corps the same time as the Soviets pull out. And then they create this Korean Military Advisory Group, which is only going to be about 500 officers that will then work to train the South Korean military. And so it was something that I think they had, even gone back to the Moscow conference about when they would withdraw these forces.
It had been planned for a while. Yeah.
Syngman Rhee was, very much against any kind of coordination with North Korea or the Soviets or anything. So it was not something anybody, was really looking forward to, because it took, the American power out of South Korea. And then it starts getting run by the State Department, because MacArthur didn't want to have control of forces there that weren't able to defend themselves. That's what it right. kind of seems, right. To come out to be, that if he was going to have control there, they would have to be able to, support this, yeah. But they don't, that's not in the U.S. policy, at that time. And then it comes down to, are they really looking at South Korea as being part of that littoral defense, which is, that island chain that comes through? Because it does get left out of the State Department, briefings by Atchison, and MacArthur does leave it out. So, and I think that's why it was kind of a surprise when Truman was all in for going for it. But it's kind of U.S. policy, so it's
and had been for a while.
It's not like something that you say this guy did that, but it had just been looking as returning it to the South Korean.
Next question. Did MacArthur's successful maneuver in Luzon influence his decisions at the Battle of Daejeon? And was he inspired by any historical examples during the operations to establish the Pusan perimeter?
I don't know if he ever said, I did this because of this historical thing. MacArthur, like Ed Drape, who's, one of the great military historians of American, he point out, MacArthur always trusts his instincts and his experience more than anything. So I think you could definitely say that, he'd be looking at that. I mean,
what's offensive? What's defensive?
Well, I think he's talking about the withdrawal from Lingayen Gulf at the beginning when the Japanese invade, and Wainwright does the pullback, at the, I mean, that was as helter-skelter as it's going to be for Dean and this, Task Force Smith and, these first task forces they put in there. But I think MacArthur thinks, they've got to not only try to do something to delay the North Koreans, but they've got to do something to give some moral sort of influence on the South Koreans as well. Because if they say, okay, we're coming in, and they just start going down and working in Pusan, and they're not helping, the South Korean forces, which are, haphazardly withdrawing from the North Koreans, they might have just fallen apart. You don't know. And so I think there's a lot of that balanced into it. I mean, the task forces do get wiped, and they were, under strength. And I think the only reason Task Force Smith gets thrown in is because they were actually doing plane loading training, where they get on planes and, and how they would be put into cut. And so they're the first ones that get put over there. But it does give Walker the time to set up that Pusan. I mean, it's always going to be very tenuous, because they'll throw the Marines in there and stop them, the 27th Wolfhounds, and they'll stop them. So, I mean, it's a very close run thing, the whole way, until Incheon springs it all open.
Right. All right. Next question. What was MacArthur's relationship with General Walker like?
It's very distant. I mean, Walker comes out there, and I don't think MacArthur sees him that much. It's like Eighth Army is yours, and he's tasked with starting to train this force, because as they're drawing down that power from Japan, they want these occupation troops to start going into combat readiness, but I think they only get to be like battalion level that they actually work with at this time. But, MacArthur doesn't see Walker a lot, at the like July 4th parade, things like that. I know that Walker and MacArthur's chief of staff, Edward Almond, can't stand each other. And so, I mean, that's probably going to have some play in that as well. It basically came because the wives couldn't stand each other. Almond's wife and Walker's wife, and there was a lot of, jibing over that. But I don't think MacArthur trusts Almond or Walker. And that's why, he's so involved in those entire first 3 or 4 months, because he's monitoring them. And that's why when Ridgway comes in, MacArthur knows Ridgway, and it's like, it's Eighth Army's yours, and I think he feels when Ridgway comes in that he doesn't have to monitor them as much. I mean, I think, Walker does a great job. I think he doesn't delegate authority much, because he's very effective in that Pusan perimeter.
And I mean, when he dies, MacArthur is.
Oh yeah, wants to give him the Medal of Honor and wants to give him full generalship.
But
that Walker, when it came to them retreating from the Chinese, he saves the army. I mean, they lose contact with the Chinese, but that's why Ridgway has an army to resurrect, because Walker gets it out of there. Yeah.
Would you say with MacArthur, if he's micromanaging you, he doesn't trust you, and if he lets you go, he trusts you, or is it more complicated than that?
It's probably more complicated. That, I mean, I'm probably just organizing it all in my own mind. But in World War II, when he's on Leyte, and like the corps commanders like Siebert and some of the division commanders, when MacArthur shows up, they don't like it, because he knows more about tactics than they do, and they're the whole time like, is he questioning what I'm doing? Is he worried about? And that's the truth, that he knew his business, and no matter what people thought of him as far as MacArthur being MacArthur, he knew his business.
Right. All right. Next question. What was the working relationship like between the American and Korean military leaders at this early stage in the war?
Well, the Korean leaders are going through a lot of getting rid of people, after because I think Che was the chief of staff, and then he becomes a division commander, as they go down, and a lot of the guys get killed in the early days. I think they're looking for any kind of response they can get, from the allies, the NATO people. The Secretary of Defense of the South Koreans is very close working, I know, with Muccio and some of these, who's the ambassador there. But a lot of that military is fading, and other people that's like when Pak Sun-yup rises up at that, and gets noticed, because they're, once everything happens, you see what people are able to do, real quick. And so I think that Walker is able to work with people and those corps commanders, but there's a lot of language friction and not understanding each other, and sort of big brother, little brother, type type atmosphere that goes on. So it's very much in flux in those early days.
What about MacArthur's contact? I mean, who's his main liaison?
With the Koreans?
Right.
Syngman Rhee.
Okay.
I mean,
but from a military standpoint.
Yeah. No, I think he's got that Walker. That's his job because he's the the man on the ground there, and he's over everything. Yeah.
All right. Last question. Was MacArthur eager to take command in another war?
I don't know. There's the apocryphal story that supposedly MacArthur said Mars's last gift to an old warrior. Mm-hmm. But I've never been able to find where he actually said that. And that was supposedly like when he was going on the first trip over there to, take the viewpoint on the 29th of June.
I'm sure he thought it was destiny. And I'm sure he would have been upset had anybody else been chosen before him.
Well, he's commander-in-chief Far East. I mean, and there's,
but I don't think he was, I don't think he loved war, and I don't think he thought, well, this is wonderful. No. So I think it was probably a mixture of, oh great, here's another war, and well, of course I'm the most qualified.
Well, it's also, pull the rabbit out of the hat again. You've got a horrible situation. You go take care of that, and he does what he always does. It's like we were saying before. He goes by what he knows and what his experience is. So that first day he gets there, he's like amphibious op. That's what we did in World War II. That's what's going to happen now. And so I think it's, kind of matter of fact in that sense. But I think that, like you said, the idea of destiny that he has, like once again, I'm in the saddle, I've
been called to serve.
Yes. Again. And there is no one that's going to be able to do this better than me. And that's, you don't want a general I don't feel like I'm up to it.
Yeah. All right. Well, those were interesting questions. So
they were. And there's probably a lot better nuanced answers, a lot worthy of a lot more study on my part for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. And thank you again to everyone for those questions. And we look forward to doing another one of these again in the future. We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.